How can we overcome the shame of abuse? That's the topic that we're going to discuss today on Flourish-Meant. I'm your host, Tina Yeager, and as you can see, I have two wonderful women with me. One is a longtime friend and someone that I've always esteemed highly. Her name is Eva Marie Everson. She is the founder and CEO of Word Weavers. She is an author, multiple best-selling author. She's also written books that have been affiliated with film, and her co-author, Miriam Feinberg Vamosh, is also an award-winning author, and she is amazing. I have a book that they co-wrote before. It's one of my most treasured gift books that I own. It's about the Holy Land, and it's got rich, deep descriptions and all kinds of details about it. So I encourage you to look for that, as well as their new release, which is, even though it's a novel, it really addresses the deep heart behind what women who are abused now feel and how they have always felt throughout history. I'm excited about getting into this topic today. Welcome, Eva. Would you like to say something to start with?
Yes, I would like to thoroughly introduce my co-author, Miriam Feinberg Vamosh. She is in Haradar, Israel, which is just above Jerusalem. Been a guest in her lovely home and met her lovely family, and we did work together on this book. The actual title is Reflections of God's Holy Land, A Personal Journey Through Israel. We met in 2002 when I was a journalist in Israel, on a journalist tour. Miriam was our interpreter and our guide, and we just became fast friends. And then I went back in 2007. We wrote a book together, this book that you're talking about, for Thomas Nelson, which came out in 2008. And then Miriam and I designed a tour that Miriam had a long time desire to do. And that was that a tour should begin in the wilderness, in the desert, and then come out of the desert into the Galilee and then on into Jerusalem. And we took 5 other journalists with us, and did that in 2009. And then Miriam came to me several years back now, and said, I have this little piece of information. I'm going to let her tell you about that. But the result is ahoti, and that is Hebrew for my sister. And it is a story of Tamar, the daughter of David. So Miriam, if you would tell the listeners more about how you came across this story.
I came across the story thanks to the scientific advisor on a book that I wrote about daily life of children in Bible days. And it turns out that he is an expert on an ancient document called the Words of Gad the Seer. The words of Gad the Seer are actually mentioned in the Bible in Chronicles, First Chronicles, as a book where there are more stories to be told, it says in Scripture. But it was assumed that this was a lost document. It wasn't, in the end, it wasn't lost. It had been sitting for a couple of centuries in the library at Cambridge University. It had been found in India by a Christian clergyman in the Jewish community of Cochin, India, and eventually made its way to Cambridge University Library, where it was studied, but not in any depth until Professor Bar Ilan came across it in the 1980s. And in 2015, he published the definitive book about this ancient document. And he suggested to me, the document has, I think, 13 chapters, and it's after it, in each chapter, it tells the story after the scriptural story, what may have happened, which is a very typical Jewish way of teaching. You read between the lines and you say, well, maybe this happened or maybe that happened. And so this anonymous writer had an idea about what might have happened to Tamar after the door closed on her in Absalom's house. And he said to me, I have a story I think you should tell. So that's how it started. And the rest of the story is filled out by Eva and me, taken from this ancient document. Because in your field, the story of Tamar ends like so many women of today, with the door closing, the victim silence, the families reneging on their responsibility to care for her and strengthen her. That's what happened to Tamar in the scripture. But in our telling, she eventually finds redemption and justice and closure.
I love that you have fleshed out the fullness of this story. And as I'm reading it, I am right in the middle of reading this novel, and it's beautifully crafted. I don't know who wrote what, it's just flowing seamlessly, but the descriptions are rich. I know that you went into a great deal of effort to research all the details that went into this story. I can tell by reading it. So tell me, which pieces of Tamar's story really touched your heart about her with regard to how she responded to this incident where she was violated for the sake of politics, is basically what happened in her story.
I have to say that the part that hit me the hardest, Miriam is surely to remember this moment, was actually after the fact, because we know scripturally that Absalom went after the crown, and he didn't care who he killed to do it. So, we can look at his killing of Amnon, who raped his sister Tamar. Amnon, for those who don't know, being their half brother, a half brother raped a half sister, but Absalom was her whole brother. And so then, he goes to King David and says, Amnon did this terrible thing. Now it's interesting because he says to Tamar, just go hide away. And then he says to David, oh, Amnon did this terrible thing. And David becomes angry, but he does nothing. And so then Absalom kills Amnon 2 years later. And then when that doesn't seem to do anything, he goes after David. And of course, Absalom is killed in that pursuit. But before that happens, David flees the palace, flees from his own son, and leaves behind 10 concubines. And Absalom rapes those concubines on the roof of the palace, which was tantamount to saying, I am the king. That's like putting the crown on your head in their culture. And when David comes back, he says, I will take care of him. And that struck me the hardest. And I said to Miriam, oh my gosh, he took care of his concubines, but he wouldn't take care of his bride.
So let's talk a little bit about how this is a story of the generational nature of sexual abuse. We see this in our American culture. Is this also something that we see that is not based on ethnicity? It is part of the human condition. Can you talk about what this looks like in Hebrew culture and history, Miriam?
For that question, because I came across in my early studies verses in Deuteronomy about what happens if a man rapes a woman. And that shocked me. I never forgot it. I don't remember it enough so I don't have it put up here on the wall. But I will tell you that it says, for those who don't know, if a man happens to meet in a town a virgin pledged to be married and he sleeps with her, you shall take both of them to the gate of the town and stone them to death. The young woman, because she was in town and did not scream for help, and the man, because he violated another man's wife. You must purge the evil from among you. But if out in the country a man happens to meet a young woman pledged to be married and rapes her, only the man who has done this shall die. Why is that? Why would that be? She suggests the answer. She was in the country and there was nobody there to hear her cry out. So only the man is killed, but she's not at fault. And in fact, I made that part of the book because remember, Eva, or maybe you've gotten there already, Tina, where David looks it up in the scripture. We didn't have Deuteronomy and all the books divided, but David, like rolling it out, says, let's see what the scripture says. And he says, well, and he comes to the conclusion that that she was in the palace, so she could have cried out, and which in today's culture we're taught just survive, whatever you have to do to survive. But you had to have that outcry by the victim according to Deuteronomy. And that ends that part of Deuteronomy talking about the father. If a man happens to meet a virgin who is not pledged to be married and rapes her and they're discovered, he shall pay her father 50 shekels of silver. He must marry the young woman, for he has violated her. He can never divorce her as long as he lives. So, and when we look at the Bible laws, the laws in Deuteronomy, we say, wow, that's really advanced. There are a few things that, given the culture of the day, there were a few things that protected women. And this was considered one of those things that protected women. So obviously that culture no longer applies in modern Jewish culture, but in the culture of our Orthodox Jewish brethren, only now are they beginning to give women the voice that they've had in Western countries for several decades now. In our Orthodox Jewish culture, that's only just starting.
So we're seeing in all cultures that women have had their voices taken away, and you so beautifully describe that in your novel. I know that you did some research on what women go through in order to come up with that. Can you talk about when a woman feels silenced? What are some of the things that are pushed upon her regarding the culpability issue? And you mentioned some of that, Miriam. Eva, would you go into this? Because I know that you have not only done research, but you've had experience also representing some women who were victimized in another situation. So you have some personal knowledge of some women who've been through things like this. So can you talk about that, Eva, and why that was important to your heart to include in the story?
My own personal experience aside, because we all know that a large percentage of women have been assaulted in one form or fashion, whether that's been a full-on assault or, a partial assault. Especially in my age group, we look back on it and go, well, yeah, that was just something we had to deal with. Was that if a woman was in the workplace and she was going to be treated a certain way and we were just supposed to look the other way, et cetera, et cetera. But for a short period of time, I also worked in the DA's office in one of the Georgia counties that I lived in. And I worked particularly with the Victim Witness Association office there. For too long, what we said was, just don't say anything. That was, and whether or not somebody said that to a young woman, she knew, because there was a shame that was automatically invoked, whether she understood it or not. So you just said nothing. But then there was a time when we said things like, if a woman came forward and said, I've been raped, or I've been sexually assaulted, however, whatever form that came in, she was then questioned about, well, what were you wearing? And where were you? And had you had anything to drink? And were you flirtatious at all? And we saw that for decades upon decades upon decades. In the interesting thing to me about Tamar's story was that if you go back and you read in the scriptures, Absalom almost lays a blame on her, but he says it in such a way that makes you ask yourself, how did he know that so quickly? How did he know it was Amnon so quickly? Was he a part of this? Well, I think he was, because he wanted that crown. And that was one of the things that Miriam and I talked about. So what does he say to her? Just go into my house and be quiet. Just, I'll handle this. But of course, he wasn't handling it for her. He was handling it for himself. And too often that's what we saw in our culture. And still in some cultures, women are stoned for this. I mean, they are killed for this. Well, I would say it's crying shame, because it really is a crying shame. It's horrible what we do, and that that women for so long have been treated like commodities. And in this culture, she would have been a commodity. She was the daughter of the king. She was a commodity. She wasn't just his daughter. She was a commodity. And you have to then wonder too, was David thinking, well, can't give my virgin daughter away now to some other king so that I can now marry two kingdoms. There's so much to consider here.
Yes, and this is about objectification of women.
Mm-hmm.
And it's also about power and control, which is always the issue, the root issue behind abuse. It goes back to the original sin in the
Mm-hmm.
Garden of Eden, which occurred because women were not given protection or value. And the man, during the time of temptation, just stood by and let it
I've
happen.
often said it's the man's job to
So
kill the snake.
it's not totally the man's fault that there was a fall of sin, but that was part of
Right.
that story.
What
That
was he
was a
doing?
part of that story that rooted all the way through the relationships between men and women. And
Mm-hmm.
we still see that issue today.
Mm-hmm.
It is not because God's will is for women to be treated that way, is because our flawedness caused that to be part of our experience as human beings on the earth. So before we get into more of that, how to overcome this shame, that'll be in the next part of our story. If you're watching this on video, make sure you watch the second video as well. But for now, I would like for you to offer the links where people can stay connected with each of you and where they can find a copy of this beautiful, beautiful novel, Ahoti.
It's Eva Marie Everson, author.com. And Ahuti is sold in brick and mortar stores, but also any online store, barnesandnoble.com, amazon.com, christianbook.com, booksamillion.com, walmart.com, all of the .coms. I do believe I checked Target, and I don't believe it's in Target. That's okay. But just, check. If you go to a brick and mortar store and they don't have it, ask for it. They will order it for you. And that, of course, is good news for us. Also, let me encourage you, if you go to your local library and they don't have it, ask for it. They will order it for you.
My website is my name. It's www.miriamfeinbergvamosh.com. And I have a blog which deals with a lot of different things having to do with the land of Israel and the Bible. And every once in a while I post on the blog, and they're all in there. And when I was first doing my research for Tamar, for the book, before we even started it, I wrote a blog on several of the characters in the story, about Tamar, of course, and then about her, apparently, her grandmother. Her grandmother appears not in the Bible, but it appears among the rabbinic sages when they sat around one day in the shade and they said, "None of these men have mothers?" Well, they have mothers, but what are their name? Like David in the Psalm says, "My mother and my father. I am a stranger to my mother and my father," I think. I might be misquoted. And my brothers. So they decided to give names to some of the biblical characters, and they gave a name to Tamar's grandmother, David's mother. And when I discovered that, I looked up all the information about her, and I wrote a blog about it so that I could prepare myself that way for inserting her into the book in a very big way.
And you had a very special person who is going to be the narrator for the audiobook version. Would you talk about that a little bit as far as where people can access that and who is narrating your audiobook? It's very exciting.
I wish I had a video of me falling out of my chair when they told us that Yasmin Al-Bustami, who plays Rama on The Chosen, had taken the assignment to be the voice actress for Ahoti, the audio version. And of course, you can get that at places like Amazon.com and BarnesandNoble.com. Anywhere where you can get audio versions. You obviously can't do that in a brick and mortar store, but anywhere that an audio version is sold, you can download it. I downloaded it. You can already do that because we're filming this before the book actually releases. But she does a fabulous job. She really does. If you go to YouTube and you look up Paraclete Press, which is our publisher, you will find videos that Miriam did from the Holy Land, and also that she and I did together, talking about some of the elements of like David's relationship with Tamar, Tamar's relationship with Seven, things like that.
Thank you so much for all of that wonderful insight and those bonus features that you can find. I hope that all of you listening have enjoyed this amazing conversation with these two authors who brought tremendous expertise from their rich backgrounds to bring you a story that can help you on your journey of healing or equip you to lead someone else on that journey as well. And of course, I also hope that you will hit subscribe and come back for the next episode of Flourishment.